I'll begin with just a little bit about my own personal history as a gay man. I grew up in Belfast in the 1950s and 60s when times were not good, and I first became aware that I was gay when I was about 12 years old, and like almost everyone else, I then spent many years feeling alone and fearful about my sexuality. No one ever spoke to me about it. I had various encounters with peers and contemporaries, but we never spoke to each other, and so I remained isolated. It wasn't until I was 16 at school that a supply teacher in my English class read us Catcher in the Rye. Many of you will remember that the protagonist, Holden Caulfield, comes across gay people in New York, and the supply teacher started a discussion in the class about homosexuality. I immediately pricked up my ears and became very interested. This man told us that there were gay pubs in Belfast, particularly the Royal Avenue bar in the centre of Belfast. So I made my way there that very evening. I must have been an ugly youth because I stayed there all evening and no one spoke to me. And I didn't speak to anyone else, so I left as isolated and fearful as the way I went in. And I didn't go back. And then it was 5 years later, in a conversation with a fellow student in the club bar up by the university, I first discovered that there were gay organisations and other gay people. And I made my way to my first Belfast Gay Liberation Society meeting at Queen's University, and suddenly my life took off. I met other people like me, people who were not afraid and not ashamed. It was my Damascene moment, and the rest for me is history. I learned about gay liberation, about the early days of gay liberation from London returnees coming back to Belfast. I began to read and learn about civil rights, the feminist movement, the black movement, and gay rights and Stonewall and things like that in America and throughout the rest of the world. And during that time we were a small group, but we were very active indeed, and we set up many organisations, amongst them Cara Friend, the Gay Befriending and Counselling Service, the 1974 Committee for Law Reform, the Gay Liberation Society of Queens, which I already mentioned, that ran discos, social groups and political activities. And we ran a couple of newspapers, mainly Niagara News and Gay Star, as Stephen mentioned, copies of which are here in PRONI, with all the rest of the stuff from that time. And then we decided to create NIGRA, the Northern Ireland Gay Rights Association, of which I was the inaugural president. It was a sort of umbrella group for all those other organisations which I've mentioned. The purpose of NIGRA, and you'll forgive me if I employ the current vernacular, was to oversee and provide an overarching strategy for these organisations. So we went along quite pleasantly for a while, organising and having fun, and then suddenly in 1976 came the RUC pogrom against gay people in Northern Ireland, and 26 people were arrested in 2 days and taken away for questioning. I myself, this was the first time I was detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. I was in England at the time, whipping up support and raising funds for the Strasbourg case, and was arrested off the ferry at Larne, where the RUC were waiting for me, which was a major surprise, because these were the days before mobile phones and instant communication. So I was travelling through England and Scotland incommunicado and was totally unaware of what had been going on in Belfast. I personally was interrogated for 7 hours in 3 different locations. First at Donegal Pass Police Station, then at Lattice Drive Police Station, and finally at Crumlin Road Jail. Most of the interrogation was about gay politics and gay relationships. The RUC had been to my house and stolen my personal diaries and other papers that they used throughout the interrogation. It gradually dawned on me through the day what had happened, and I realised there had been a lot of arrests, but I didn't really know at that time. The RUC's expectation was that, as in past pogroms and arrests, I would crumble, confess, and beg them to keep it all secret. But they were confused and disturbed to meet with a gay person who was out and proud and totally unfazed by their questioning and approach. They just didn't know what to do. And that investigation went on for just over a year, cost a fortune, and led absolutely nowhere. They had in fact prepared charges of conspiracy to corrupt public morals against 4 of us, myself, Jeff, Duke Sobey, and another colleague who has since died. And we only just managed to snatch the papers from the DPP's out tray just before we went off to prosecution. Never came to anything in the end, and the whole thing was a waste of time. Around this time, the Strasbourg case was progressing. It had been through various stages with the Commission at Strasbourg, and we had had indication that it was going to go to a full court hearing. And at this time, the Reverend Ian Paisley decided to start his campaign of Save Ulster from Sodomy. So we started a counter-campaign which was Save Ulster from Chewing Gum. Now, we didn't get quite as many signatures, but the effect of it was really important. And then, apropos of the Strasbourg case, eventually in 1982, we won the case in Strasbourg with a majority decision in our favour. And the government of the time, that was Mrs. Thatcher's government, was forced to use the instrument of an ordering council to extend the 1967 Sexual Offences Act to Northern Ireland. It hadn't been extended because at the time, as was the practice, when there was any legislation concerning Northern Ireland or Scotland, it would be done on a Friday night after the Ulster MPs had gone home on a Thursday. Having done the deal that they wouldn't include Northern Ireland, that allowed them to save face. Anyway, several years later, then in 1982, Thatcher's government had to do it. And we all went to the House of Commons. And for the second time I was detained at Her Majesty's pleasure and thrown into the dungeons in Westminster because we had a public outburst when the Ordering Council was actually passed. We'd been a long time waiting for it, and we're quite excited. So I spent the evening in the dungeons whilst everyone else went off to a party in my house to celebrate. And I didn't get sprung from the dungeons until Robin Cook came along at 3 AM and got us out, and then we went to join the party. And then I was finally detained in 2012 again at Her Majesty's pleasure, but this time in the ballroom in Buckingham Palace, as I joined Jeff when he received his MBE from Princess Anne for services to the gay community. So it just goes to show, if you live long enough and wait long enough, everything will come full circle. Thank you.
Can you get this to put the pictures on?
Oh yes, you can get that.
Well, I don't know how to. They set out on their own. There's a timing apparently. That will move along. So I think there's an automatic system that they move of their own accord.
Okay.
So I don't know if it's going to work.
Okay, I can do it for you.
Well, as I say, there's no rhyme or reason behind them. They're just every 20 seconds one moves.
Okay.
Okay, well, just following Richard as the warm-up act, so you've got a lot coming up, so be prepared. I'll try and move these along. Just as I say, they're at random. The pictures are just a backdrop for you to rest your eyes during the intensity of my talk. So where Richard did some of the more day-to-day discussions of what happened to us in that period, I'm just going to do a little bit of legal background, just so that those, I know some of you know all this backwards, but the law existed, and whenever we're talking in this early 70s period, the law that existed then was twofold. The Offences Against the State Act, sorry, completely wrong. No, it was the Sexual Offences Act, different act, 1861, and the 1885 Labouchere Amendment, which is basically outlawing anything other than sodomy. So these laws existed, and it was life imprisonment for sodomy. It was the penalty in that case, 2 years for 2 years for any other action, and that was where the charge that was laid against Oscar Wilde, and he got 2 years hard labour at that time. Previously, the law on homosexuality had been a religious law. Really, it was inherited from medieval times, and it was governed by the church. These sort of laws, but they then became civic in and around the 19th century. But it was a crime, as was mentioned, I think, at the time when they changed, they withdrew the death penalty about 1830s. In the discussion in Westminster, they talk about the crime that couldn't be spoken of by Christians. They didn't actually put a name to it. So you can see the absolute. It was beyond intolerance. It was just completely blotting out any concept that this action or activity or outlook existed at all. So from the Wilde trial on, the things obviously got worse in that respect, and it became almost unmentionable as well as unspeakable. And it took 30-40 years for matters to gradually liberalise and things to improve. Up till maybe the Second World War, the two groups of people that probably did know about homosexuality and were able to live with it or talk about it were the upper classes, the aristocratic classes, and the arts and cultural classes, because they did seem to be able to manage, a lot of gay people seemed to manage a life in both those categories. The only other category were the people who lived sort of subterranean life to a degree, but actually had the courage to go out and about and mix with their own kind, in a sense. And it'll come up later, but I've written a biography of Roger Casement, who was operating as a gay man from, say, 1880 to 1910. So, and he was perfectly able, and partly because he lived abroad a lot of the time, but he was able to operate in a silent way. No people, his friends, did not know. Well, that's not strictly true. Some friends did know, but by and large, his acquaintances had no idea that he had a secret life outside of his work and politics. The big change came after the Second World War, and although there was a sort of new Puritanism in the 1950s, which led even to the extent of the recently deceased Lord Montague of Bewley being arrested and charged and convicted of gross indecency in the early 50s, but that nonetheless led to a liberal enthusiasm in some respects for law reform, and the government appointed the Wolfenden Commission to look into it. Wolfenden, who later, when it was now discovered, actually had a gay son, reported in 1957 suggesting a decriminalisation, and of course then took 10 years for any change to happen in England. But for local angling, it's important to recognise that one of the most prominent MPs organising to try and bring law reform about was the Ulster Unionist MP for North Belfast, Montgomery Hyde, who took a great interest both in Oscar Wilde. Well, his particular literary interests were sex and spying, so he wrote books on every aspect of those two categories. But he wrote a book on the trial of Casement, and also on 3 books on Oscar Wilde. And you might imagine he had a slightly difficult time trying to be the MP for North Belfast and keep his constituents happy, or more importantly, keep his constituency association happy. And he managed it until he rather overdid it in the late 50s. And at a time when Ian Paisley had become a member of his constituency association, and he had just been a little bit too sanguine about his survival, and he didn't attend the ratification meeting because he was on an important and arduous tour of Jamaica for the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and rather foolishly didn't show up, and he lost by a relatively small margin of votes. But that was the end of Montgomery Hyde in politics. It was a sad moment in many ways, but Northern Ireland was outside the law reform, as Richard mentioned, from 1967 onwards, when it was put through in England and Wales. Scotland came 10 years later through Robin Cook's efforts. But as Richard mentioned again, we were a tiny community at the time. People did not speak of homosexuality. There was people were jailed. There was a roundup in Bangor in the late 60s, earlier one in Lurgan, where something like 30 men were convicted. But there were hints of change in the era. The one thing I was talking of books about gay matters, obviously James Baldwin novels, John Reckie, City of Night. If you knew these books were around and had been reviewed, you could get hold of them. The local one that always fascinated me, and really a very good read, was The Liberty Lad by Maurice Leach, which actually depicted a gay bar in Belfast, and his main character was an MP who turned out to be gay, a unionist MP who turned out to be a secret gay and also a secret Roman Catholic, which made it slightly complicated results in the whole thing. Anyway, we were a small group, but we were young at the time, and we were angry, and that's enough to keep us going and to keep a movement engaged, and actually a movement that became a problem for the authorities, which, as Richard mentioned, led to these raids in 1976. I think it was the point of view that we were a conspiracy, which we were, because we were both calling on law reform, but also engaging in the very acts, the criminal acts that we were trying to decriminalise. And that meant that the police had if you could almost say, a duty to round us up. Well, it was a wise move, it's another matter entirely. And it had to go to London in the end. The Attorney General was the one who put a stop to the prosecutions. Not quickly, but I have to say it was a slow process before the prosecutions were terminated. Just a small point I only recently discovered about the raids. Whenever I was arrested, the very day I was arrested, because I've been reading the Hughes report on the Kincora inquiry, the very day I was arrested, the same policeman, or one of the same policemen, and the Assistant Chief Constable Maharg involved in that, had met to discuss complaints about the Kincora residents were making about their the staff at the home, and for some strange reason they chose to arrest the adult gay population of Belfast rather than these individuals who were abusing their power and their charges at Kincora, which tells you about priorities at the time in that respect. So we started the campaign for law change and we tried to get things through Stormont. Now that was recognisably a bit of a lost cause. There was a Alliance Party law reform minister, Oliver Napier. We attempted to make some headway with him, but he did not recognise this was a candidate for law reform, and the 74 Power Sharing Assembly was swept aside in mid-74, at which point the only way forward was through Westminster, where we tried efforts there. And I happened to come across, because I had some political training in radical and left-wing politics, Kevin Boyle, who was a lecturer at Queen's and had been part of a case to the European Court of Human Rights at Strasbourg. In a case in relation to Ireland and the UK and the torture of internees. So he pointed out that there was a case that could be made and taken to at Strasbourg, and it wouldn't be that difficult to win. He felt it was a pretty open and shut case, because something that was life, for which you could be in prison for life in Belfast, was something that was perfectly illegal in Birmingham, and not even Strasbourg could tolerate such a discrepancy. So the case was put together in 75, 76. It took 6 years to process. It was, for those of you who are legally interested, it was based on Article 8, the right to a private life. Now, I'm quite sure the guy who partially wrote the European Convention on Human Rights, Lord Kilmuir, or David Maxwell Fyfe, would have turned in his grave if he'd recognised that it was going to be interpreted in such a way as it turned out it was going to be. But we won pretty heavily, as we expected, on the right to a private life. And I think the vote was 14-5 in that respect. And the problem was we had to face the lawyers from London and Belfast who were in opposition to us. The lawyer they used the Belfast lawyer the Northern Ireland office used was Brian Kerr, who later became the Lord Chief Justice, whose argument was that Northern Ireland was a particularly religious place, that and Catholics and Protestants were united in recognising that this was an evil that had to be stopped at all costs. The London lawyer was Sir Nicholas Bratza, he wasn't then Sir Nicholas Bratza, who argued that it was not time, neither the time nor the place for Strasbourg to change British laws. As I mentioned, both of them got promoted quite significantly. Bratza became president of the European Court of Human Rights, ironically, and actually mentions my case on his website as one of his successes. He happens to fail to mention he was on the wrong side of the bench in that particular one. So to get the case going and to move it along, we obviously needed money. And we raised quite a lot of money through the Discos at Queen's, which we ran for every other Saturday for a year or two. Exceptionally popular. There was very little else going on in mid-70s Belfast, so it ended up kind of more popular amongst straights in many ways than gays. We had a gay news appeal in England and the rest of Britain, which pulled in a very large amount of money, and we even got some money from Tom Robinson, the singer of Glad to Be Gay. Quite a lot of money from him in the end, so we were well funded. The case cost, just for those interested, cost about £4,000, which probably was a lot more then than it is now, but it's still quite a low level of money. And so we achieved a considerable amount. A European first in gay matters. We created a pathway for Cyprus and the Republic of Ireland to follow, and they managed to get decriminalisation rather rapidly compared to our 7 years. My case was quoted in the US Supreme Court in a Texas appeal, which basically outlawed criminalisation in the states in the individual states in the United States, and it's very unusual for a European case to be quoted in the US Supreme Court, as they're fairly insular in their outlooks. And it still is being quoted up in where a lot of ex-British colonies and Asian and Arab states, which have very harsh laws, inherited and not, as the case may be, but in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So it continues to be the case. So it was an achievement, and we all have to be proud of what we did. Unfortunately, all the next set of reforms that were pending after '82, changing the age of consent, equalising the penalties and such like in sexual offences, and civil partnership, all those three had to be fought yet again through the Northern Ireland office, which was reluctant to use the Strasbourg precedent to prove to the local politicians that they had to do this. I'm just reminded that of the papers I got through Freedom of Information a year or two back, whenever the Thatcher took power and they discovered that the previous government had shelved a law reform possibility, it was put up to the NIO minister who scribbled on a piece of paper where it was suggested they had to do something about this. He said, let Strasbourg do the needful. So this was again a sort of attitude at Westminster. We'll want to avoid at all costs doing anything to irritate the natives, particularly something that they believed could unite Catholics and Protestants, which of course was only true if you believe this place is hegemonically religious, which I don't. I think we all know it's a relatively small, if organised, religious groups in charge of politics here, and that will and has changed. So we had to fight our way through all the subsequent reforms, and as you know, we're now in the middle of a huge debate on marriage, equal marriage, gay marriage, same-sex marriage, you name it, whatever you want. Now, many of us of an older disposition or probably don't regard it as the beginning and end of life, whether we can get married if you're gay. That's true. But it's very important to younger gay people, and I have to recognise that, and you have to realise that it's become a test actually of modernity. As you may have noticed, the leader of the party I represent, the Ulster Unionist Party, described it as being, if his party failed to vote for law reform, as they may well in many cases, but maybe not all cases, that they would be on the wrong side of history. And it is a defining moment, gay marriage, because as we know, in the South, 60% of people voted for it in a referendum earlier this year, and basically the whole country took off in a state of cheerfulness and pleasure that they had brought this about. So, you know, the world has changed incredibly, drastically, since we were younger. Some of us here would I think, agree there. And from being criminalised, we're now being commemorated and treated as stars, and it's no harm. Thank you.